so we're going to have one final discussion section. We're going to jump right to topic 4 because it basically encompasses everything. What we wanted to talk about in this final section is we wanted to get a sense for how the HCA could support your equity needs. You know, for different people, this means different things. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's otherwise. And we wanted to get a sense for what the pressing needs are. What are the local mechanisms that might exist that could help solve them? How we could help you work with local partners, and if there weren't local partners, what we could do to help you achieve sustainable solutions. And I'm going to start off by calling on 2 people, just because they both presented passionate things, and I think that there's a lot that we could learn from them. The first one that I'm going to ask is Silvio. I'd love to know what are the most pressing things that exist that we, as the HCA, could do to help support engagement in Brazil.
Oh. Okay. The way I see it, you know, we have a enormous capability in terms of science that is already the country, but I think we need, you know, greater challenges, and I think the HCA is one of that opportunities. Let's say, I mean, we would have, you know, our local problems, which could be of international interest, but I think engaging HCA is an opportunity to make part of a larger scope and international, how should I say, impact science. It's a real challenge. I think it's, you know, when you read the mission, you see that it's a really great challenge. And that's the kind of thing that perhaps we need to evolve even more in science. When I'm start to answer this, it came to my mind things that happened before, and some people said it before, was not here, and that's, I mean, the largest outcome of the space program in the United States in the 60s was perhaps not even reaching the moon, but, you know, the science that was developed along the path. So HCA gives us both opportunities, you know, at the same time to engage in a really important problem, and also to develop things that are needed in that direction. I mean, I can think of other things, you know, just came to my mind right now. But that's one of the things that I think could be important.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
So Judy, how can we make sure that we do not fail if it's not an option?
So our biggest problem, and I think most of my colleagues will agree, is supply. Access to research supplies and access to scholarly literature. Are there potential local mechanisms to address them? Yes, there are. It's just that they are biased. So when we work with the WHO, for example, for all the projects of WHO, they deliver all the reagents required for the WHO projects at our doorstep, which means the mechanism exists. It's just that we can't use them. CDC has local offices in 45 different countries. It's very easy for them to get supplies, clear customs. Will they help us? So there are always mechanisms that can be used and leveraged. So yes, HCA can facilitate by coordinating and working with them together.
Okay. Are there other, so those are 2 perfect examples of things that HCA could try and potentially engage, try and understand how they work through barriers to entry in different regions. Are there other examples that people have of things that, or parties that are good people with which to begin working to try and solve some of the problems that would plague efforts to make the HCA equitable?
Yes, so I just wanted to suggest if you can find a funder willing to fund it, then I think you should put out a targeted HCA-related call specifically for low and middle-income countries, or specifically requiring a partnership with a low and middle-income country. Because once you start getting a few on board, it becomes more well known, people will start engaging with it, etc. At the moment, I don't think the HCA is actually that well known in many LMICs. And the best way to get it known is to put out a targeted call. If it's not targeted, quite a few people might feel, oh, look, the awards are just going to go to Boston, so why should I bother? And one final point is, if you were to choose the route of a partnership with an LMIC, then I would recommend that you say the principal applicant has to be based at the LMIC.
So it's a fantastic suggestion. The one thing that Silvio brought up in his talk and became clear when we went to Brazil that I'd like to ask people for solutions to here is it's not that the CZI call was not open to people in Latin America, and it's not that they weren't trying to advertise, it was that nobody in Latin America was ever made aware of it. So, you know, one of the things that we took away from this was that being connected to FFSP so that we could send them the call so that they could distribute it to their network was one of the most tangible ways of getting people engaged. And so I'm wondering if there are similar things that exist in other regions, you know, say for example in Africa, where there are bodies that we should connect to. We had talked to Tom about potentially going to AAS and sending it to them so that they could distribute it to their network. But are there other parties that we should think about so that the word actually gets out? Because it would be great to have a call specific to LMICs, but we would need LMICs to apply.
Can I just quickly answer that? One thing that's popped straight into my mind in answer to your question is to engage with the African Society for Human Genetics. Mm-hmm. And you could come to H3 Africa meetings as well. We have 2 of them a year. I think there's definitely a piece here about going out and promoting and making this more widely known, because it really isn't well known in LMICs, I don't think. Since I have the mic, I might just make my point that I was going to make, which was, I appreciate that HCA has still not quite resolved the issue of whether it's a health atlas, a health cell atlas, or one that will focus on disease. But from the experience of H3 Africa, from the very early discussions we had, you know, to do a sort of genome diversity project, we very quickly realised it had to be focused on disease. It changes the entire flavour of the discussion, the engagement, and it gets you closer to benefit. Talking to Jennifer Moreau's point, it takes you that little bit closer to trying to benefit the populations, and it also addresses Christian's point he made about engaging with communities, the so what question, why do it? And it's going to be quite difficult, I think, to sell an HCA just as a thing to do. And having a disease focus will also help you engage with the real experts, and it gives you a sort of which might be an easier way to start.
It's a fantastic point, and it's something that we'll bring back to the organizing committee. Deciding whether or not it is more than just a healthy atlas is above and beyond my pay grade. I personally do a lot of things in disease, and so I see the opportunities there. But I think that one of the things that's important to emphasize is that a lot of the tools that are being used for the healthy reference, the things that we think would be good to disseminate, are applicable to disease samples as well, and they're actually applicable beyond humans. I mean, we've even sequenced parasites before using exactly the same strategies. So I think that there are parts of this where, even if we're just expanding and the focus in regions is not necessarily on the healthy reference to start, that there's some opportunity. But I will say from the research that we've done that the way that we envision this might work is to always do a healthy in combination with the disease samples so that you can contextualize. And so part of it would support HCA, but a lot of it would support local priorities in terms of research. So that's the thought that I have in my head, and I'd love to hear people's impressions of that and whether or not that would make sense.
I'd like to make a very practical suggestion. I think that the way for people to engage faster would be if people could see each other in a more, user-friendly way. So you have a lot of groups that are already engaged in HCA. They don't know much about us. Not all the groups don't really know about equity. Maybe many of them don't have access to the discussions we have here. So maybe something more straightforward to these groups, like if you could reach out to the groups which are already participating in the HCA actively and talk to them, and maybe make a list of these labs that could receive our students, and our postdocs for some time to engage with the protocols, and then they would go back with things that we shouldn't do, for example, because we're all considering which technologies we should invest on, and maybe we're not making the right decisions. And you have access to these groups, so maybe this could be a faster way for us to engage.
It's a fantastic point. First of all, I will tell you that there is no right technology. all the technologies kind of work, all of them don't work, and they do different things. And so it's, just back to the point that Farhad made, it's nice to have communities to speak to ask these questions. The thing that I would ask back to you, because I've been discussing with Jonah and CZI and a couple other people, piloting some of these exchange things, is would you rather have people come to Boston and sit in our labs, or would you rather have groups from the HCA come and visit and interact with larger contingents? I mean, I could see the value in it being catalytic to have people actually come down and to create a community, but I could also see how coming and getting to know a lot of people and having conversations would help to nucleate local communities. So which one do you think would potentially have more bang for your buck as a place to start?
I think it really depends on the city, depends on the country, so they have really different necessities. That's why I think that if you engage the HCA community, the labs, and talk to them about what they have to offer, like some labs, maybe they say, well, we have funding to receive students. Others may say, well, we can send people, but we cannot get any student here because we don't have any room or any funding. Then we would have a better idea what could be done. I really think that when people go to the places that are actually doing all that, it's a very important experience. But I really think it depends on the institutions and countries and cities. So.
Just quick answer to you. A quick answer. At the HCA meeting in Barcelona, we did present this, and the community was very welcoming and very happy to do this in both ways. So, especially to send people, because there's so much expertise, as Alex has said, in the community, and so that's sort of a brief answer, but there's
people to see it,
yeah, absolutely.
You have to find a way to make people notice that and know it. So maybe a list on your site or something, but something very practical.
I think part of that is creating, online documents and online videos and links and things that people can use, and trying to create educational materials. We've thought a lot about whether or not some of the efforts that have been done in edX or Coursera to make publicly accessible educational resources would be something that would be valuable, as well as potentially just creating a help group so that you could ping and we could try and help figure out who would be the right person to direct you to. So, go ahead.
So, from the African Academy of Sciences, we are doing a lot of program implementation on STI, obviously for purposes of development for the continent, and one of those areas is health. I just want to take a moment to appreciate the Wellcome Trust, because we are talking a lot about shifting the center of gravity of African science to the African continent. What that really means is that we should work towards funding African scientists to be the leaders in these projects that they do, and then they can partner with anyone outside of the continent. But they are the lead scientists, and that solves a lot of the issues that we've been discussing today, because then they can do local development in terms of capacity building, infrastructure building, and we are talking more beyond just training young scientists on the continent, but rather retaining those scientists, which has been the key problem. We have a lot of African scientists that are trained, but they are not on the continent. For us to retain them on the continent, we need the infrastructure so that they don't feel like they need a better environment. Our goal is to create conducive, attractive environments on the continent, and the only way we can get to do that is by funding projects on the continent. And beyond that, we are also, we are having conversations with both the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on how we leverage on what we already have. So we should be talking about how do we use H3 Africa, how do we use Delta's program, how do we use all these other programs that are already on the continent so that we don't start from scratch. One of the issues that we deal with at the African Academy of Sciences is the fragmentation of projects on the continent. We don't know who is doing what where, and because of that, the limited resources really are not maximized. So I'm encouraging you to think about some of those things in setting up your HCA project. The other thing is that when you do the centers of excellence or regional institutions that are centers of excellence, the other thing that we are trying really to cover is to make sure that it covers the entire continent. So Africa is not South Africa and Ghana and Kenya, have countries that really need to be brought along this journey. And so when you're doing, for example, if you have to put out a scheme, we have to be thinking about how do we make sure that South Africa is actually cooperating or collaborating with DRC or Chad or some of these many countries in the middle of the continent that we see that don't have capacity, and we don't want them to be left behind because pathogens don't know borders. And then finally, I think you have a great opportunity to work with a lot of us who are already thinking about longitudinal genomics cohort for the continent. This has been a topic of conversation between us and the Wellcome Trust. We are talking about genomics work, both pathogen and human genomics work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Francis Collins is very interested in doing this. So how then do we work all together so that when you're enrolling people for the HCA, those very participants can be consented for the longitudinal studies. So there are a lot of opportunities, but I think there's a lot of conversations that needs to go into this and bringing the right people on board. Thank you.
Oh, just one more thing. In terms of
where would people rather be trained, again, in my opinion, we find that training people here is better because then they are retained. If you don't do that, then the other model that seems to work best is what Yolanda alluded to, where you send people to an institution for X period of time with fellowship funding when they return for the first 2 years, so that they know that they are actually taken care of for the first 2 years, for them to actually establish their work and have a few students to get started. The most recent one that we are running from the academy is UPTI, which is funded by both the Bill and Melinda Gates and the NIH, and they are spending 2 years at the NIH, and then immediately after that we send them back to the African countries with funding, 2 years funding coming from the Gates Foundation. Thank you.
I want to make a couple of points. One, to address the question that you asked, and again, in line with what she just said, these training programs are best done in the country where where you really want to send these technologies to. Having said this, sometimes it becomes very difficult to impart training programs in the country that requires it, because the training program might require the platform, in which case the platform may not be available. Therefore, it's absolutely critical that somebody goes from that country to the lab where the platform is available. So, in terms of my own experience has been, where you need the platforms for wet lab work, you need to send people. But if you have a large bandwidth, if you're looking at computational, then it's much easier to do it, or much better to do it in the country, because a lot of people can benefit. In terms of the funding issue and training, I think it's a good idea to both put these two things together, the training and some kind of a project funding, because otherwise what happens is that these people, they will get the training but will not be able to do any projects based on those platforms because they don't have funding. And like Shayuti said this morning, that oftentimes it's like a catch-22. You don't have the platform, so you don't have the experience, so we cannot fund you for the platform. So I think it's a good idea to sort of put these two things together, training and a small project, such that things can actually move.
Well, thank you. I think I want to build on to what Jennifer said. I think it's important to really leverage, I could say leveraging, because there's pretty much available on the continent. For instance, there are places where you would need minimal investment presently on this continent to really implement all of this. And it's important that you identify such centers and see how you can use that as a platform actually to build the necessary continental capacity, for instance, in the case of Africa. So, and there are, for instance, we have like a 2-month training program that we do just for genomics, and we do that where people come in and then they are on the ground, or we call it a boot camp, for 2 months, and all they do is genomics. So I think, and this is a mandate that we have from the World Bank, with one of those centers, that where we've been mandated actually to train a critical mass of African scientists in genomics. So, and technically, when you look at the platform, we pretty much have everything that you need to do this. So the investment is going to be minimal. And you want to leverage such. I'm sure you probably have in Ghana, you have some other places. And that becomes a platform where you could train, as she was saying, people from DRC, from Chad. We bring people from all of those, and then they're on campus for 2 months doing only and strictly that, those kind of training. So you could leverage such a platform and see how you can bring this, and then use such a platform to actually implement the training. That way, one can accompany with some minimal investment, some funding in order to support, sustain, for instance, so that they can translate the training into practical examples in the field. Small project that can address, local problems that are very important. And for instance, you could also leverage that to say, well, you want healthy and then disease, for instance. That's very practical. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd love to point out that we actually want your help in identifying the right partners to do this. We were inexperienced in a lot of this. There's a lot of expertise here, and we'd like to figure out how we can work with you to make these things happen. But I want to let other people speak really quickly. Go China.
Thank you. I just want to bring up a slightly different point. Equity and fairness in the wider world, not just single cell, it requires enforcement. So, you have laws because you want to, put some teeth behind your ideas of justice. Now, we heard some sad stories over lunch about why do projects fail, and many of those stories were, well, we sent our samples or we sent our data, and then we had explicit agreements, but those people violated those agreements, and then we, cried foul, no one listened, and nothing happened. So I think that's a question of where you have rules already, you have written agreements, you have principles, they're violated, there are no consequences, there's no enforcement. And I think the enforcement really has to come from journal editors, funding agencies, and then universities, the administrative heads of universities. When something like this is raised, there has to be a formal mechanism for addressing it.
Thank you very much. I just want on what Jennifer said here. No, I think the reason why the gene drive for cold mosquito succeeded, there was lots of position that was solving an African problem. And look at malaria, 90%, 91% of the infection deaths are Africa. That was an African problem. There was so much opposition. My humble suggestion to Adam James is, there are some problems that are really African problems. You can say malaria, you can take six-month anemia, you can tell HIVs. Now, and I discussed this over lunch time, when you choose those organs that you're going to make an atlas, for example, sickle cell anemia is the red blood cells and the circulates, maybe and the veins actually. Can we have at least 2 or 3 of them targeted, where African scientists can lead and it can solve an African problem? That will give quick wins for Africa, and you get that thing called realizing sustainable solutions here. But by the way, this is not just only for human diseases. Even if you look at animal diseases, when you look where the West is with the Africans, you find the West tend to focus mostly on the diseases of their own area. My humble request, let's have priority, at least choose 4 things here that can give quick wins for Africa.
Perfect. And just to echo a point from this morning, we really would like Africans to drive, the science that's a priority to them. So we would really love you to figure out what are the tissues and areas that make the most sense based upon the diseases and the problems that are of relevance here. And we'd love to figure out how to partner with you to help support these things. You might say, why would we partner in these things? What is the value to us? I think that I'll give just a personal example of why this is useful to somebody like me, which is that as we apply these technologies to new samples, we recognize problems that exist, and it gives me new things to engineer solutions to. So it's actually, a mutual benefit to both of us, because it can help to address problems that are important to you, but it also can help me identify areas where I can further innovate and help people. So I would love to hear what are the problems that are relevant, and then hear how we can help through training, through empowerment, through whatever it is to help you apply these technologies to address those problems. So.
I'd like to make a plea for global training of cohorts of trainees who come together regardless of which country they're from, because I think the issue of sending individuals away to intern at foreign laboratories and then come back is that they're still solving problems on their own, or leaning very heavily on the lab that they were interning in. If you train cohorts, be that cohorts within Africa or actually cohorts across India, Bangladesh, Thailand and Africa, you're training a generation of scientists who will draw on each other. And although not all of the problems are going to be the same in Bangladesh and Africa, some of the problems will be sufficiently similar that you're going to find some global solutions. So don't shy away from bringing young people, smart young people together.
I think that's a great suggestion. One thing that didn't come, Tim can just put 2 words in really quickly because we're running towards the end. I want Katrina to speak and I want everybody to have a chance to say something. Is that there are these jamborees where people come together to do these hackathons to solve problems, and they do involve bringing people from multiple different regions of the world to come together to think about how to create solutions. One of the things that I've already brought up with CZI and with a couple other people is that we would like to have broader participation and inclusion in that. And so if you have people that are trainees that you work with that you think would be interested in these opportunities and getting to know these computational communities, we would love to connect them and figure out mechanisms to engage them. Anything I should add on that?
Yes, we do that. That was the case.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to say this is a really diverse room, so there's a lot of different scientists working on a lot of different things. We have some ethicists in the back, we have some outreach and public engagement specialists, we have funders, we have computational people, and so it's wonderful to kind of hear from everyone. And I think one of the difficulties with HCA, which you model it on the human genome sought to get a reference. HCA is also seeking to get a reference, and I think hence that initial focus on the healthy, but actually I think there's a really interesting conversation here about how disease can go in parallel, and that might be more useful for a lot of people. But I guess there's some tensions here, because we don't actually know where HCA is going to stop, or actually what's even going to define the first atlas, the second atlas, the third atlas. And when you first talked, Alex, you talked about so if equity means fairness, then what might that mean for HCA? There's representation, so maybe diverse tissues from around the world. There's participation of diverse scientists, and then there's the benefit piece, which we had a really interesting, slightly curtailed discussion on. And there are probably tensions between all of those different aspects, because you could have a totally diverse HCA with all the right samples that was done in a totally non-equitable fashion. The big genome center model. Similarly, you could have an HCA that is not really diverse in terms of tissues, but it has really diverse participation from scientists who are interested in their own questions that are, pertinent for their own regions. So I think, I know this question is kind of trying to ask this audience how the HCA can support their equity needs. I think what you could potentially bring to the organizing committee, which is ultimately the kind of the decision-making body of the HCA, is what are HCA's equity needs as a project? What might HCA prioritize? Because once you have that, you can put into place a framework, some policies, some guidelines, the enforcement capability, lists on the website of all the collaborating labs who want to sponsor students, and then kind of move forward. So I think there needs to be a dialogue. This needs to continue both from the scientific community and also the HCA community that exists already, how we can match up those things. So it might be that some equity needs go first, like participation, which I think I get the sense is your potentially initial focus around outreach, and others like potentially representation or even the benefit need to be planned in the longer term, but they need to be planned in from now on a longer timeline.
Unsurprisingly, Katrina said in a much more eloquent way than I was going to say the point. I still am not 100% sure what is the, and I hate this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, USP, the unique selling point of this initiative. And I think that's part of why we're going, not in circles, because I think this discussion is incredibly important, because we've learned so many initiatives that you can build on. There's so many things out there that HCA can beg, borrow and steal from, but I think you won't know what to beg, borrow and steal from until you work out what it is about HCA, whether it's the science, the technology or where you're going, that makes that initiative unique and different, and then you'll work out what to beg, borrow and steal from other initiatives. And I also think that will help you define what's really going to make this initiative equitable and different to other initiatives. So it's really the same sort of point.
Let's do one last point. And then we're going to wrap up and we can continue this discussion over dinner.
Actually, my point is exactly that. So my name is Azure. I am an Indigenous woman from Australia. I work for the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics. My role is basically around community engagement and gaining consent from Indigenous people to be a part of our centre. In terms of Aboriginal people, we're extremely lucky. We come from a very rich country, but we're still extremely poor. We have a government that has no interest whatsoever in genetic science, particularly with Indigenous people. So we are funded basically the same as everybody else in here, and we run off the smell of an oily rag. It's the same thing. I can go out and I can deliver your program to people. That's not the problem. But if the problem is that Indigenous people in Australia want to be a part of the decision-making process when it comes to their particular samples. So if we're giving you consent to use their sample for a particular project, they're going to want to know what's going on with that, and they want to be a part of the decisions that you make about their samples, and they want you to come back and they want you to tell them what you're doing with their samples. And this isn't a free-for-all, so once they sign over consent, you get it for one project. You don't get it for anything more than that. And if you're going to use it for anything more than that, you're going to have to go back and get consent again, and that's just the way that it is. And it's because Indigenous people in Australia, although we are underrepresented severely in genomics, we are still heavily researched upon, and people go to us all the time taking our samples and our stories, our intellectual property all the time and claiming it as their own, and they've had enough. So that's the kind of thing that we have to deal with. The other thing is that in Australia we have a handful of people that are working in genome science, so Indigenous people. So I think we have about 4 or 5. We've got one person at the moment over in Oxford, but we're really underrepresented when it comes to the science industry. So.
Thank you. Do you guys want to switch to the final slides? Just so we can say our thanks really quickly. So, let's go back one slide. Ooh, it's right here. So I think that one of the things that I wanted to highlight is the HCA really is a grassroots movement. I would encourage everybody here to actually decide to join and just to sign up for the HCA by going to the project registry, which is literally going to humancellatlas.org to join HCA and registering. One of the most important things about making your priorities and your points central to the HCA is engaging with the community and becoming part of it. It really is a series of scientists who have a goal to do something that I think will be big and transformative, and I think a lot of people think will be big and transformative, but the way in which we manifest that and the way in which we accomplish it really depends upon the people who are willing to get engaged and get involved. And so I would hope that each and every one of you would be willing to. Recordings from today's talk will be posted on the YouTube site. It is a ugly URL. We will email it out to each and every one of you. There's a series of other things that are on that website, and we'll connect you with some of the other documents that we have. And now we're going to go to dinner where we can relax and continue the conversation, where I'd love to hear more about what are the best ways to begin thinking about equity? What does equity mean to you, and how could we move forward with it? And for people who are worried about flights, there will be a bus that will return you back by 9 o'clock, both the Hyatt and the Marriott. And finally, before we run to dinner, I really wanted to take the time to thank everybody that pulled this together. Setting up a meeting like this in Addis Ababa is a fantastic opportunity, but it is also one that is extremely challenging. I want to thank the Gates Foundation, particularly Malia, who and her partners have done a fantastic job in helping us to secure the site and get this all set up. Some of the team from the HCA, particularly Christine and Elliot, who have been fantastic and made sure that this all went off without a hurdle and have been communicating with you. I want to thank all of the funders, the Broad, the Wellcome, the Reagan, the Chen Zuckerberg Initiative, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, without whom we couldn't have possibly done this. And I actually think it's a really nice sign to the goal of equity that multiple different funding bodies are all contributing to putting this together. It shows the broad support for this, but it also shows that this is something where we're all going to have to pull together. I want to thank the entire HCA community, because this is a series of scientists who've been working together to come towards what we think is going to be a transformative reference. And these are all people, as Musa brought up earlier, who are very excited to partner with you to help teach techniques, to collaborate on different projects, and really to try and make a transformative impact. And I want to thank you all for coming. I know that it's not a small ask to get you on a plane and to get you to spend a day here. You're all very busy, and we're incredibly appreciative of the time that you've taken and of all the input you have. Musa, anything you want to add?
This last session just made me think that we didn't have enough time. And we need to have this conversation much longer, much deeper, and much more consistently. So I want to encourage all of you to go back and let's find a way to keep this conversation going with all of us in the same room. And hopefully we can get some of these funders to support that. But I think the necessity of it, the questions that were raised, the fantastic points, they tell me that, it's like what was said, failure is not an option. And this discussion is what makes us not fail. So thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Partha, any last concluding thoughts? We'll let you close it out.
I just wanted to say that we really didn't have discussions on those 3 sessions in any detail, but we did have some discussion over lunch. We'll try and summarize those, but those of you who have the time and energy, if you could send us an email, telling us what your comments are or what your points are in terms of those discussion points that we discussed, that would be very, very helpful, because we are supposed to write a document for the HCA organizing committee as to where we want to take this ethics equity to. So we'll put those points in as we write that document. Again, thank you very much for participating in this meeting, and I thank all the funders, all of you, and everybody who is here and who has been very supportive, the Secretariat, and all of us. Thank you very much.